like to talk about Democratic talking points. By that, I mean these topics, these themes that they use, but they seem to be divorced from reality. Take the Epstein files. Remember Epstein files? Epstein files. Epstein files. Got to have the Epstein files released. They all said that Trump was hiding things. And rational people said the Democratic administration had the files for 4 years. This isn't about politics. It's about patterns, consequences, and what's coming next. So let's start with someone who doesn't just react. They've studied how this plays out. Given what they had done to Trump with lawfare, you would have thought that there was anything incriminating. They would have released it. And then, of course, there were rumors that 80% to 90% of the people mentioned in the files were Democrats. And then there was also an investigation through leaks that Donald Trump ostracized Jeffrey Epstein. And here's the key point. Before, he was convicted of sexual crime, so there was nothing there. And yet, as soon as Trump comes in, Epstein files, Epstein files, Epstein files. So he releases them. And what does it show? Exactly what everybody knew and what the Democrats themselves knew. Did they say, we're sorry we cooked this all up? There was nothing in the files there. No, they went on right to Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, federal affordable. Let's shut down the government. It seems like numbers don't matter anymore because whenever they don't fit the story, they're just thrown out and a new round of excuses begins. Republicans will not give us all this money, multi-billion-dollar subsidies. And then people said, well, it was. Come on, you guys. You publicize it as the new health care plan. Only 25 million Americans are in it, a small fraction. It doesn't work. You yourself said that they needed subsidies and you were willing to put a time limit on it, and the subsidies ran out and they weren't even enough. It's just constant. This isn't the issue. Yes, it is. Affordable Care Act. Affordable Care Act. That's all that matters. Affordable care. And then the government was shut down for the longest time in history. 40 days and now it's open. Has anybody heard anybody talk about the Affordable Care Act? I haven't. And then it was Trump's health. Trump's health. Trump's health. He's got spots on his arms. He has kangles. He's limping. He looks bad. He's losing his mind. Everybody said, wait. You people hid the demonstrable cognitive decline of Joe Biden for 4 years with a very strange White House media conspiracy. When you lay those narratives side by side, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The conversation keeps getting dragged back to spectacle. Trump's hands, his gait, imagined diagnosis whispered by partisan anchors. Anything that keeps the spotlight away from the real metrics that affect ordinary people. And that's exactly why the next pivot lands with such force. Once the noise fades, you're left with the numbers no press secretary can spin. Because behind all the talk of accessibility and partisan theatrics sits a stubborn fact. Under Biden, cumulative inflation hit 21%, reshaping daily life far more than cable chatter ever could. Now you're suggesting that Trump is not non-compos Mendez, but he just took a health exam, an MRI body scan. No. His cognitive decline, cognitive. So then he releases it. It shows that he's in perfect health for someone his age. Does anybody talk about Trump's health? No. And then it's affordability. Affordability. That's what it's all about. Affordability. Well, wait a minute. During the Biden administration, there was a cumulative inflation of 21%. That averages out to 5.2% per year. When Donald Trump came in January 20th, 2025, it had dipped to 3%, but given all the things that Trump has done, it's still 3%. He has not increased inflation. He has brought in $10 trillion at least of foreign investment. There's going to be enormous stimuli next year as far as oil and gas production at record levels, the big, beautiful bills, deregulation, tax cuts. And do we hear about affordability? Affordability. Not really. I mean, there's no real issue. The inflation rate is lower this year than in any year on average of the Biden administration, and it's going to get better next year. So what am I trying to get at? What's going on? And why do they fixate on these themes and then they just drive it? And the fact is, they're acts of commission and omission. They feel that they can create chaos. They can make people angry. They can bomb Tesla dealerships. They can shut down the government. They can stop ICE. They can tell soldiers to disobey orders. But that's a negative message. What is omitted? That's the committed message. But what is omitted? Do they say, here's my alternate plan for immigration? I want 1 million, 2 million, 3 million illegal. I want to go back to the Biden 2 million illegal aliens a year. I want nothing. Obamacare. Here's how we're going to solve it so we don't need subsidies. A, B, C, nothing. Trump's health. Let's have an annual weed legislation that every president has to have an annual physical every year, and everything has to be transparent. If that had been true, Biden would have been 25th Amendment in the first year of his term. This isn't about economics, not even politics. It's about a systematic dismantling of the lasting foundations that hold society together. And that's the real danger. Do they have a crime initiative? Do they have a foreign policy initiative? Do they have any initiative? No. So what they try to do is create chaos. So we'll all lay down in the fetal position and say, please stop it. I don't want it. Or they're going to talk about affordability, without ever mentioning it, that under their OPACEs, the DEI, the ESG, the Green New Deal, it was all regulate, restrict, slow down, and we had 21% inflation. We had low GDP. Do we want to go back to that? So they don't talk about it. So don't pay any attention to Epstein files, Obamacare, Trump's MRI. Affordability. Well, these are all just excuses for the absence of 51% on the issues and a lack of a systematic, comprehensive alternate agenda that they can present to Donald Trump. That all this is absurd does not mean it doesn't work. I mean, we have a candidate who in Virginia, running for attorney general, said that he wanted his opponent dead and his children dead, and he won. He won. We had a candidate for the mayoral race who said he wanted to seize the means of production, and Mandami won. We have all of these races where crazy things happen, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept them as not crazy. They're crazy, and don't pay any attention to them because it's just an excuse for the lack of a serious agenda. You can call it reform, you can call it strategy, but in practice, it looks more like a quiet, deliberate demolition of what's left of the system. The November 2026 elections will be determined fairly or not, largely on the status of the economy. The left knows that they know two things. One, that the enormous projected gain in oil and natural gas production. Two, the deregulation and tax cuts involved in the big, beautiful bill that will kick in full in 2026 and some $10 trillion in foreign investment, even if that's maybe only half of what's promised. But that's an enormous amount, 7 or 8 times more than Biden received in his last year of office. You add all of that up, an economy right now that is doing well, and Black Friday falling for Thanksgiving had almost $11 billion in online sales. That was a record, not just better than last year at this time under the Biden administration, but better than in any time in history. So the economy is already strong, and you can imagine that these catalysts and this stimuli that are coming, deregulation, tax reduction, massive foreign investment, expelling 2 million people from the United States per year who were probably on social assistance, involved many cases of crime. You can call it reform, you can call it strategy, but in practice, it looks more like a quiet, deliberate demolition of what's left of the system. You can see what's going to happen. The economy is going to boom in 2026, and the left knows it. So what is their strategy? Don't talk about the Trump economy. And we've seen what go after Tesla, firebomb Tesla dealerships, drive Tesla off automobiles off the road because Elon Musk is the prince of darkness and he was involved in Doge. Demonize Doge, go after ICE, have street theater, have riots, call them Gestapos, say they're worse than Hitler. Go after the National Guard that has cleaned up Washington, D.C. Encourage massive resistance. Call it illegal. Shut down the government. Shut down the government for longer than any period in history, 40 days. Shut it down for no purpose. It gained nothing. Supposedly, it gained nothing. Shut it down. Have major senators on the Democratic side and representatives cut a video. Have them tell the American soldiers, all 1.3 million active duty strong, you don't have to obey an order. If in your legal wisdom, your vast knowledge of jurisprudence, if you're a private and he says go over that hill, I don't have to do it. It's illegal. Create disruption. And the piece of resistance, the Epstein files, you have the Epstein files for 4 years under Joe Biden, Democrats. You knew that Donald Trump expelled him from his circle of friends before he was convicted of anything. But there are about 80% or 90% of people in the so-called Epstein files. These are emails. These are text messages. These are transcripts from court proceedings. These may be IRS files, but 80 to 90% are Democrats. That's why it was not released during the Democratic administration. But no matter, just say Epstein files, Epstein files, Epstein files, Epstein files. Too many coincidences to be accidental. Too much loss to call it an experiment. Let's be honest, there's a plan. The only question is whose. So Donald Trump finally says, okay, they're released. And what do we hear? Crickets, maybe a little bit about Larry Summers, Democrat, but silence. Why doesn't the left demand that every single name be released? Because they have more Democratic donors than Trump has Republican donors that are mentioning. So the Epstein files, like the shutdown, like the street theater, like all the videos, like all the smutty language, they were designed for one point, one reason, one goal. Keep your mind off the economy. Create a word called affordability. The real message is we Democrats raised prices by 21% when we were in power. 5.2% per year. We had enormous budget deficits. We ran the debt up by $8 trillion. We had a $1.1 trillion deficit. Don't talk about that. Just say that Donald Trump in 10 months has a 3% inflation rate, the same as when he entered office, and therefore he's responsible for the 21% that we ran up, and we'll call it affordability. My message to the Trump administration and all of you listening is tune out all of the street theater, all the pornography, all the smutty language, all the insurrectionary activity, and just focus on the economy and talk. 2 points. 2 points. How much better it is already than the average of the 4 years prior, but more importantly, demonstrate why it's going to be booming in 2026, and why the Democrats don't want you to think about that. Too many coincidences to be accidental. Too much loss to call it an experiment. Let's be honest, there's a plan. The only question is whose. Rather, that term loosely refers to a corpus of hundreds, if not thousands, of text messages, emails, phone records between Jeffrey Epstein and hundreds of people. And because that he was a spider-like person that had a web of entrapment and gave lavishly, and I would say, at the outset, 90% of the monies that Jeffrey Epstein gave to that had a political affiliation, were Democratic, and left not Republican. Get that straight right now. And when we look at all these numbers, it feels like someone's deliberately playing the game of ignore the obvious. But the problem is that obvious is what ends up destroying our lives. So he was everywhere trying to buy influence, and one of the ways he bought influence was apparently in his various domains. He had underage attractive girls that he trafficked and manipulated, and his modus operandi was to get powerful figures to come in under the opasses of discussing statecraft, raft, politics, great donations he would go to, and then they would succumb to these temptations of pedophilia, supposedly unlawfully so. And he would have cameras and document that. And then the subtext was they would be bribed, and he would offer to manage their financial affairs, or for a small donation to him. Then he would keep that secret, and he used that to gain influence and money. And when at his death, he was probably worth $500 million. And so now people want to find out who was included in those communications. But here's the problem. Everybody says, Donald Trump, we're going to get Donald Trump. He doesn't want to release it. But it doesn't quite make sense, because the trove was under the jurisdiction of the Joe Biden Department of Justice under Merrick Garland. They had them for 4 years. Oh, do you really believe that if they had something on Donald Trump, who admittedly knew Jeffrey Epstein as a 1980s, 1990s celebrity in Manhattan, everybody seemed to know him. But if they had something incriminating, they leaked almost everything about Donald Trump. Remember, they raided his home to get, just a few classified documents, 102 out of 14,000 papers. They raided an expert. They tried 25 states, tried to get him off the ballot. He was the object of 91 felony charges in 5 different jurisdictions, civil and criminal. You think if they're going to go to the impeach twice during the first term, if they're going to go to that effort and they had incriminating evidence, and they wouldn't have leaked it. So they kept it quiet, and then when Donald Trump became president, he had it under lock and key, and there were rumors that Pam Bondi or Kash Patel were going to release it, and he didn't. And there's 2 schools of thought why he didn't. The first is that he thought that it was a distraction from his economic. He had a better economic record than Joe Biden. He didn't have 5.2% on average every single year, but people were talking about the Epstein files, and so he just wanted to get it out of mind and not visit it. It had the opposite effect by suppressing it. People became more curious. So once Trump avoided releasing the files, whether out of political calculation, strategic caution, or simple fatigue, the vacuum only deepened. Critics on the left insisted his silence meant guilt, while supporters argued it proved nothing except his desire to stay focused on governing. Yet, the moment those early leaks appeared, a different picture emerged. Even the individuals closest to Epstein acknowledged Trump had avoided the behaviors others indulged in. And that's precisely where the dilemma sharpens. Because if innocence wasn't the barrier, then the pressure likely came from somewhere else entirely. Powerful donors, anxious allies, and people terrified of seeing their names stripped of context. And of course, there was the charge from the left that he suppressed it because he would be incriminated. There would be a direct reference that he was involved. But we have just the opposite. What files or communications that have leaked out suggests that even some of the young girls knew that Donald Trump was not engaging in the type of activity that others were. So what was the other reason? Why didn't he release it then? He was innocent. It wasn't a matter of distracting from his economic. Was there another reason? Probably maybe the same reason that Joe Biden didn't leak it, that there were prominent donors or officials that were either Republican or Democrat who just didn't want to be embarrassed. Well, how would that function? Somebody might call it President Trump. This is Mr. Smith. Jeffrey Epstein came over to my home twice. I visited his home. We were discussing a large gift I was going to give to Harvard University, but my name came up, and without context, if my name is released, I will be incriminated because he is toxic. That could happen. So there's all sorts of explanation. There is even a fourth or fifth dimensional chess explanation. I'll throw it out there. In other words, Donald Trump knew that he was not in those files, but he had heard before he became president for a second time during his first term, or he had seen in the first months of his office, that 90% of the references of GI fundraising and money and associates to the degree they were political involved Democrats. He also knew that unlike himself, who had ostracized Jeffrey Epstein before he was convicted of trafficking and sexual crimes, that is before he was a de facto pedophile, he had distanced himself and others had not. So in this kind of strange explanation, or ex-Jesus Donald Trump, but that gap between silence and release invited a different reading one that cast Trump as restraint. Not as fear, but as calculation if he knew he was unimplicated, and if he understood how overwhelmingly the names tied to Epstein leaned toward one political side, then holding back created its own kind of pressure. Let the speculation simmer. Let opponents overextend. Let the media demand disclosures they privately dreaded. In that framing, withholding the files wasn't avoidance, but leverage, a slow-boiling tactic that exposed who truly had something to fear once the first elite names began surfacing. Then just let this sit like hot water on a kettle and simmer and simmer and simmer. So then the Democrats would overreach, say, get it out, get it out, get it out. Out, and he thought, they didn't get it out because they are incriminated, and now they've leaked all they can about me. And unlike me, a lot of these people were involved after Jeffrey Epstein was convicted of a sexual crime, and I'm just going to let them demand and clamor until an opportune moment I will release. I'm not sure I believe this ex-Jesus, but that is what has been commonly alleged more recently. And lo and behold, they're starting to release the Epstein files and Democratic luminaries like Larry Summers, former Secretary of the Treasury, former president of Harvard, who can't get much more elite and renowned than that has already distanced himself from his Harvard former employer and Democratic grandees, because he is mentioned in the Epstein files as asking for advice, how to, I guess you would call it, he says, get horizontal or bed. A young woman, I don't know what age, so in this case, they are going to release the files, and they are going there. There's going to be Democratic names in those files and liberal names in those files, and their names will occur in context, not before private citizen Epstein was charged with anything, but after they had to know that he was a convicted sex criminal, and after he was convicted of that. They continued these relations of some sort of nefarious activity as alleged, and we're going to watch this. If that were to be true, then Donald Trump put a big noose out there. The Democrats unwisely put their head in it, screamed and yelled that Donald Trump was guilty, and then he pulled the lever, so to speak, and they've hung themselves. We'll see. But it's a sordid business all the way around.